Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. My name is Drew Benson. I'm the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management and a senior wealth advisor with Raymond James. I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. I'm a former economist, and I'm currently a certified financial planner. So today I interview Dr. David Henderson, who is a professor emeritus in economics at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. He is currently a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. David was a senior economist for energy and health policy with President Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors from 1982 to 1984. He's the author of multiple books, most notably The Joy of Freedom, An Economist's Odyssey. He is also the editor of the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, which communicates to a general audience what and how economists think. The Wall Street Journal commented, quote, "His brainchild is a tribute to the power of the short, declarative sentence," end quote. David holds a bachelor's degree in mathematics from the University of Winnipeg, and he also has a PhD in economics from UCLA. He has appeared on numerous media outlets from Fox News, C-SPAN, CNN, The NewsHour, with Jim Lehrer, CNBC, Squawk Box, MSNBC, BBC, to CBC, and others. He's also written multiple articles for the New York Times, Barron's, Fortune, and others, but one of his greatest claims to fame is that he has published as many articles in the Wall Street Journal as his current age. David is 73. Lastly, David, or Dr. Henderson, I should say, was my macroeconomics seminar professor in graduate school. In fact, he admitted to me before this interview that he looked up my grade. I was a little nervous because I didn't quite remember what I got in his class. He told me I got a good grade, and he said he didn't pass many out. I'm pretty relieved. Today, you're going to hear the second half of my interview with Dr. Henderson. We talk about the specific economic fallout that occurred during the government lockdowns. So let's talk about the trade-offs then. This is a good way to segue to kind of the first set of questions I'd initially had for you. There are costs, right? There are trade-offs when you do draconian lockdown measures. And as you know, trained as an economist, we are trained. We learned this in your class. I learned this in almost every economics course I've taken, that part of the task of someone trained in the social sciences, particularly economics, is assessing and weighing opportunity costs, which clearly wasn't occurring. Let's talk about the economic costs. What do you see as the economic fallout so far from lockdown measures that you'd want people to know about?
So at the federal level, one of the huge ones is our government debt. Mm-hmm. So together, Trump and Biden, as measures that were explicitly about COVID somehow, added, I think the number was added in together, $8 trillion to the federal debt. And that was all about making up, in Trump's case, making up for the fact that he'd pushed state governors to shut down their economies. So we got to give people money so they can buy things. And then Biden taking it further when there was actually even less justification for it.
Correct.
But together, I mean, that's a huge thing right in itself. Also, I'm not a big fan of public schools. I don't think they teach much. In other words, someone can go through public school and not learn much from the teachers, but that doesn't mean they don't learn much from the other kids. Mm-hmm. And so requiring that kids not go to school and requiring that they isolate from each other, even aside from school, had enormous costs. I mean, I think that civil society is really important. Mm-hmm. And I think we have a less robust civil society now than we did then. So I think that is one of the hugest costs of this.
We've been more isolated to our homes. We were then, and I think you're seeing this tendency, particularly with younger individuals, to spend more time in isolation with screens, and the breakdown of community and society is not healthy for us. at
Yeah.
all. And the rise of mental health issues is extraordinary. Uh,
Yeah.
I actually was speaking to a friend, and that's what he does. He works with people with mental health issues as a therapist. And he said, Drew, it is unbelievable how much this has exploded since the pandemic, the amount of
Yeah.
people that
Yeah.
are dealing with suicidal thoughts. And so those are the tragic costs that I don't think were considered during the lockdown measures.
Yeah. And I know of a few cases where a restaurant owner actually committed suicide. In one
Mm,
case, it was a friend of a friend,
that's
because his
horrible.
business was gone.
It's
But
horrible.
also, even the George Floyd riots. So I think that the protesting against what that cop did was completely justified. It was good to have the demonstrations. But I do think that the extent of the riots was in part due to the lockdowns and people
Hmm.
kind of screaming, let me out. And then,
Mm,
of course, destroying the businesses of completely innocent people in
mm-hmm,
Minneapolis. And I think that's a piece of it.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think people were definitely antsy. I know when I had the ability to feel a sense of freedom, it was like I wanted to do everything. I wanted to go to every
Yeah.
restaurant, try every food, go on
Yeah.
vacation. Like I wanted
Yeah.
to go crazy.
And I remember, so our daughter at the time lived in San Francisco and then she moved out, but now she's back in San Francisco. And she had to move her business online. She's a Pilates instructor, and it was amazing how quickly she did that. She did that
Great.
in a day. The
Good
day
for her.
the mayor announced the lockdown in San Francisco, which preceded Newsom's, she did it. Um, so that was in late March, and I said to my wife in early May, we should drive up there and see Karen. And my wife goes, well, are we allowed to? And it was a good question because the way you heard it, like the answer might be no.
Mm-hmm.
And so like we said, okay, we'll drive up, and if the highway patrol stops us, we'll say that she broke her leg and we had to get food for her, as if DoorDash doesn't exist and we hope the
Right.
CHP doesn't know it exists.
Right.
And of
Right.
course, no one stopped us.
Mm-hmm.
But so, and we did it safely, what we thought was safely. We got to her place. She ordered food that was delivered. We kept our distance. We didn't hug her. And we were eating outside on her patio. And then we walked to the Golden Gate Bridge and came back. And on the way back, my wife said, this was early May. This has been the best day of my year.
Wow.
That's how important it was to see our daughter. And so, yeah, just where was I? Why did I think of that? It was, oh,
Well, I
about
think
civil society and about just
yeah.
all the ways that we couldn't do things we were used to doing.
We need community, we need relationships,
Yeah,
and being with a loved one is precious. So I
yeah,
think your
yeah,
your wife probably in a really profound way was feeling how important that really is, right?
yeah, yeah. And there's this federal judge who is on the most important circuit court in the United States, which is the DC circuit. I became friends with over email on the phone a guy named Stephen Williams. He was one of the most
Mm-hmm.
libertarian of the judges.
No kidding.
And he died in the hospital of
Mm.
COVID, and his family couldn't visit him. Like,
Oh,
come on. That I just think that's horrible.
it's inhumane.
Yeah, yeah.
It's inhumane to not be with a loved one in that time is well, I have a large family. I have 7 kids, and there's one of the few times
You
that
have
we
seven
weren't.
kids of your own?
I have 7 kids with one woman, and
Brian Kaplan would be so proud of you, Drew.
okay.
He wrote a book titled Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. So I've interrupted your story, but go on. Go on.
I'm gonna read that, and I don't know Brian, but I want to get to know him, so I'll reach out to him now.
Yeah, yeah,
That's phenomenal. Well, as an aside, and I don't say this I'm not trying to virtue signal. We do have a demographic problem globally, and we're coming to the terms with this problem. So I'll just say, David, I'm playing my part with the demographic problem, global, solving Social Security, brother.
Well, I
um,
have another friend, Catherine Pakulak, who wrote a whole book about it and it was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal because she's become friends at various Liberty Fund seminars, and she has 8 kids, I think. So
no
yeah,
way. Did she
yeah.
just write that article? Like the
She wrote
last
the
few
book
weeks?
recently, and it was reviewed in the last few months. Yeah,
Okay, because I just read a long article and I'm trying to remember the name. That must have been, there were 2 articles I've seen
yeah,
recently, so I bet
yeah,
that was
yeah,
one of them.
Yeah,
That's
it's
that's
great. It's
that's
great.
phenomenal. I might reach out. Actually, that's a topic I want to address on this podcast, so maybe I'll reach out to her.
She would be a
Um,
great interview.
yeah, that sounds phenomenal. So I'm just thinking more about the cost, right? It's something that Jay pointed out, and this is something that came out of the UN, Jay Bhattacharya, that is that children were actually sold into slavery. I think a number as high as about 4.5 million, due to the
Mhm.
fact that when you have, like in the United States, when you lock a country down, we still have a level of supply. Like my pantry, by the way, is pretty huge, as you can imagine,
Yeah,
and we could probably survive for a few months with the amount of food we have in there. But that is not the fortunate, I'm a blessed man, and that's not the fortunate reality of a lot of people that live in some of these poorer nations. So when you shut a supply chain down, when you lock an economy down, there are actual human tragedies, and there was an amazing amount of human toll. Jay also pointed out, and I don't know the exact figure, I want to say it was 230,000, but that children in India, about 230,000 Indian children, sadly passed away due to what the UN was calling food insecurity, i.e., they were starving to death. And so I
Mm.
think those are the costs that I want listeners to understand, is that it's not just the experience of people in North America, in the United
Yeah,
States and Canada, where we can stay home. I'm doing
yeah,
this interview on really fast technology, nice computers. You're sitting in California, and I'm sitting on the other side of the country in New Hampshire. We can sit as the laptop class and do this,
yeah,
as Donald
yeah,
Boudreaux has put it.
yeah,
Not every country is fortunate of that. And do you know
yeah.
of much research on the human soul, or have you looked into that at all, of what some of the actual costs to life there were out there?
I haven't, but here's a fact I vaguely remember because I've used the prior fact a lot in various talks I've given. In 1995, the UN set this goal of having the number of people in extreme poverty in the world fall by over 50%. And extreme poverty then was defined as living on under something like $1.90 a day. Inflation adjusted, it's about $3 a day. And the UN didn't have a plan how to do it. Just it wasn't a goal, it was a wish.
Hmm.
It was supposed to be by 2015. The goal was reached in 2010. And it was because of things like free trade and all these things, cell phones in these countries allowing
Hmm.
people to trade better and more and so on.
Hmm.
And what I do recall, so I've used that number and I've shown the graph in a number of talks I've given, including one just a little over a week ago. What I do recall reading is that it reversed in 2020, 21.
Hmm.
And I don't recall how much, but I think so. It was we have 8 billion people in the world.
Hmm.
It was under a billion in extreme poverty. And it's a vague recall, but I think it went a little over a billion. I think it went up by about 200 million. Now, I
Hmm.
think the good news is we're kind of back on trend, I think. But yeah, 200 million extra people in poverty, in extreme poverty, is a big deal.
Yeah, because there's obviously the risk to the loss of life from COVID, and then this is the opportunity cost, is weighing out what are the potential loss of life from from locking an economy down. And I don't have hard data, but I have read a few articles that have suggested that the loss of life from suicide or mental illness or just food insecurity, as the UN puts it, ended up surpassing the actual loss of life from COVID itself.
I
Um,
could believe that about food insecurity. I've looked in when I was writing various things more about a year or two ago. I looked into the suicide data.
yeah.
I ended up not being as persuaded that it had
Okay.
gone up that much, but I don't recall the specifics.
Okay.
I'm talking about United States, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough.
But by the
Fair
way,
enough.
one of the things in those countries like India, the population is really young. So they were not, the young people were not at much risk from COVID.
Right.
So yeah,
So touch on that. So the risk of the virus was different for different individuals, right? So the
right.
older you were, the higher the case fatality rate is.
Yeah,
Was it? You said it wasn't much of a risk to younger people. We've heard a lot
yeah.
about this so far. Where was sort of the highest risk factor in terms of age bands?
Over 80. I mean, that's what the Italian data showed. Funny story, by the way. I spoke, as I mentioned, at this Heritage Foundation event in Omaha in 2000. Let's see, 2020 October. So I was a month short of my 70th birthday, and Jay, of course, Jay Bhattacharya is substantially younger, so we're on the same stage. And I went up to him with my mask on, didn't shake his hand, and said, so tell me more about these data. And he said, oh, well, it's mainly old people. And I said, Jay, that doesn't make me feel better. I am one. I am one. But it turns out it's also comorbidities.
Hmm.
So if you were old and had heart problems, and by the way, it was typically, as I recall from data I looked at, again, this was a couple of years ago, it was typically multiple comorbidities. So
Hmm.
say a heart problem
Yep.
and diabetes, and so I didn't have a heart problem, didn't have diabetes, so I think I was in good shape. But yeah, it was over 80. That's what the Italian data showed. And I looked at that data early, and I'm this kind of casual observer of the data in March or April of 2020. What are these people doing whose job it is to look at that data? Why aren't they talking about it? And that was what was so upsetting.
Yeah, and I think particularly for school-aged kids, it was basically posed almost no risk to them, and we knew that very early on. And so, to your point, and you made this point in one of your articles, is that part of what you gain, even though you're a critic of the public schools, part of what you do get is childcare.
Yeah,
And so there
yeah,
isn't access to
yeah,
childcare, which has an economic cost for families as well.
yeah,
But it wasn't a
yeah,
risk really at all. And when I
yeah.
had read the data, I was very unconcerned about my children at that point.
What's your age range for your kids?
14. So now it's 14 down to two, or down to a baby. And at the time, it would have been, I guess this 5 years, nine and under.
That's
So
4 years ago, so 10 and under.
10 and under,
Yeah,
sorry, 10,
yeah,
4 years
yeah,
ago.
yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah,
10 and under. And they're all healthy kids. They don't have comorbidities at all. So
yeah,
it,
yeah,
it was no risk. It was my determination on it.
right, right, yeah,
I have a
yeah.
I have a final question for you. Um,
Okay,
and this is kind of taking us back to macro theory, okay? And I know
yeah,
we talked
yeah.
a fair bit about monetary policy, so I'm eager to hear your opinions on this. So we talked a little bit about fiscal policies, uh, rescue packages, stimulus packages, but the Fed did something that it hadn't done before in response to COVID, and they engaged in an unprecedented expansion. I shouldn't say it's totally unprecedented. They did increase the balance sheet in 2008 and 9. I will state this as a key differentiator between monetary policy stances of 2008 and then 2020. In 2008, it was largely, in my opinion, as a response to providing solvency and liquidity to financial institutions by injecting reserves into their vaults. And then Bernanke did something really unusual. He was paying interest on the reserves, but they were able to contain to an extent the way in which money circulated in the economy, right? What we would call velocity or M2. And that was just a different way in which they expanded the balance sheet. I viewed 2020 as a very different thing. So, in response to the pandemic, they literally kind of helicoptered money, almost like a Milton Friedman style. They printed $5 trillion dollars and helicoptered it to the system. When the Fed was engaged in this very aggressive monetary policy stance, what was your reaction to that? And what do you think have been the ramifications of such a monetary policy stance?
Well, first of all, I want to go back to the 2008, 2009, because I've been informed by two people who I've learned a lot from, Jeff Hummel, who we've talked about,
Yes.
and my co-blogger, Scott Sumner. And Scott has actually persuaded me that the big problem, and Jeff was kind of saying this at the time too, but Scott was saying it even more, that the big problem was they didn't expand the money supply in 2008, 2009
Okay.
because of what you said. If you expand the money supply, if you expand the base, but then pay people to hold, pay people interest to hold on to it, they don't lend.
That was my
And
point,
Scott's
too, by the way.
yeah, yeah. And so Scott, I think, has persuaded me that we would have had a much milder recession if they had just not done that. And what it gets at is remember that famous line that Ben Bernanke said at Milton Friedman's 80th birthday party? He said, Milton, you're right. we messed up in the 30s. We won't do it again. And then he did it again.
He
And
did.
because I thought, oh, Ben Bernanke's work was about kind of filling in the gaps in Friedman's and Schwartz's work, Monetary History of the United States. No, he was saying the specific institutions needed to be bailed out. So he was thinking specific institutions, not the overall money supply. And so he tried to preserve particular institutions in 2008. And that was a big mistake. In the 2020, they're expanding their balance sheet. But again, I said, look, for the short run, it's we're not going to have a big inflation problem because velocity is going to fall. You're
Correct.
not going to spend money when you can't spend money. When
Hmm.
there's not so my wife and I were spending about $10,000 a year on private Pilates instruction because we could afford it in retirement. That
Good
fell
for
to
you.
zero for a year.
Hmm.
So there's $10,000. I paid down $10,000 of our mortgage. And so, all those things. But then, of course, as velocity goes up, then you're going to get, as people can spend more, then you're going to get that inflation. So I remember on Facebook a few months ago, someone said, who predicted, and it was like this challenge, this young free market economist, who predicted there'd be very little inflation in 2009 and high inflation in 2021? And I said, Jeff Hummel.
He did.
you know, because and by the way, that's one thing, Jeff, and I'm sure you do this. Jeff reads the balance sheets. I guess they come out every week or something, or it's every month, but he reads those things carefully. And that's why he's been so good at some of this stuff.
Yeah, and again, I took Dr. Hummel's monetary theory class, which was amazing,
It
and
was.
and it's such a great class. And he actually changed my mind on a lot of things when it came to monetary. I was very resistant at the time in the class, and then
Yeah.
years later, I was like, "Dang, Jeff was right after all." Um,
Can I tell you a story about that?
sure.
So I wanted to take his evening class, his master's in monetary, but it was like a 16 class or something commitment. And I'd be driving, 75 miles home at night. And at my age, I was worried I might fall asleep at the wheel. So I never did it. Well, with COVID, it moved to online.
Get out of
And so
here.
I could take it from my house.
That's
And I
great.
told my wife, I'm going to take it and I'm going to treat it completely seriously. I'm going to do all the readings, I'm going to do all the assignments, and I'm going to get the highest grade. And my wife goes, of course you're going to get the highest grade. You're a PhD economist. And I said, babes, you don't understand. I read the first midterm, and if I had not done any of the reading, not attended the classes, not done all the assignments, I would have got under 40%. I mean, that's how much I learned in that class, and I did get the highest grade.
I hope
And I
so.
was so proud of that.
I, I
But I mean,
absolutely love
I've
it.
still got those notes, and man, was that valuable.
Oh,
Yeah,
I learned a lot, and that was probably the hardest class I've ever taken in my life.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
wrapping your head around the complexity of monetary policy, and some of what I learned now that I actually deal with the Fed in a little more tangible way, because that's such a profound implication on what I do in wealth management. So many
yeah,
of the terms, frankly, I didn't even understand at the time. I just kind of knew
yeah,
well enough to get through. Now it's like I know what that means. I
yeah,
know
right.
I know exactly what these terms are, and I'm really glad I took that class because it's really set me
Yeah,
up for success and understanding
that's good.
monetary policy. But
That's good.
again,
Yeah. Oh,
so no, say one more thing, and then I'll say
yeah. So,
something.
so two things about that. I remember when he said, "Okay, what's the definition of commodity money?" Do not tell me it's money with no intrinsic value. And he explained why. So I made, and of course, as soon as he explains it, I get it. Economists don't believe in intrinsic value. It's always subjective. But the other one that really helped me, you know how when the Nobel Prize is announced, the article in the Wall Street Journal saying why they won it is typically
Hmm.
written by me. So when they gave it to Bernanke and Diamond and Dybvig, we had done Diamond and Dybvig's article. And I remember I was on Zoom when we were covering it. And I said to Jeff, and this is like a few years before that announcement, I said, does anyone take this article seriously? It was so messed up. It's like banks that don't lend. And he's just like, how is this a bank? And this is to explain why you can get a run on a bank, even though it's not a bank. And he
Hmm.
said, yeah, because it's the only formal way anyone has ever come up with of showing it. Okay. So when that was announced, when I do my Wall Street Journal article, I usually am, you know, at least 80% positive about the people I'm writing about.
Yeah.
I slammed these guys. It's like,
Did
give
you?
me a break. Yeah, yeah. So, and I wouldn't have had the guts to do that if I hadn't worked my way through that article for, well over an hour and also just following the discussion in class and so on. But I was quite confident that it was a messed up article. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Unbelievable. And the Wall Street Journal still ran it, obviously.
Yeah, yeah.
Have they have they ever stopped an article or asked you
No,
to
no.
revise it?
Oh, well, they revise it every time, but it's never, oh, you're too extreme or you're too this.
Right.
It's just always make it understandable or almost always shorten it.
Yeah, yeah.
But
A little
but
tighter.
there have been 5 or 6 times when I've said no since 1996. 3 cases I was traveling, it just wouldn't have worked.
Hmm.
And 3 cases I said, you know what, I don't know enough about these people. And one case, it was Amartya Sen. I said, I think I do know enough, but if I were to write it, I'd be saying why he doesn't deserve it. And I'm really nervous about saying that if I really don't know his work. And in retrospect, I'm glad I said no because I think there's more to his work than I thought because I read some of it later. But yeah, so no, they've never rejected it or said no, this is too extreme or whatever.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah,
I've read your
yeah,
articles in the Wall Street Journal for many, many years. I was like, I'll
yeah.
show the kids. I'm like, this is my professor in grad school. This is Dr.
Oh,
Henderson.
can I just share something with you?
Yeah,
One of my
please.
goals about 4 years ago was to make the number of articles I have in the Wall Street Journal equal to my age. I turned 73 last November. I got my 73rd article about a week and a half ago. Now, it was just online. It
Con-
wasn't in the print edition, but yeah,
Congratulations. I think you said it was
thanks.
about electric vehicles, right? You'd sent that to me.
Yes, yes, right. It was kind of how to
Congratulations.
give everyone a substantial amount of what they want. So
That's
yeah,
great. That's great.
yeah,
The last thing I wanted to say, going back to the '08 crisis, was I was always of the same assumption that the Fed had provided, they had increased basically velocity. But as I started personally reading up on it more and more and more, I've been fascinated. Now that I work in this industry, I've been super fascinated by the actual instruments that had collapsed. Why were they toxic? What is a collateralized debt obligation? What are mortgage backed securities? What are synthetic mortgage backed securities? How much
yeah,
leverage was being used? And it dawned on me as I'm reading about it, I'm like, they didn't increase the supply of money. They
yeah,
merely provided, and I'm probably just remembering everything I learned in Dr. Hummel's class. They were taking the distressed assets, removing them, placing it on the Fed balance sheet, and then providing fresh liquidity. And then, like as you mentioned, they're paying interest on reserves as a way to induce the banks to not lend or not
yeah,
provide
yeah,
additional credit to the markets, which is
yeah.
quite different than what Milton Friedman's thesis was. But in 2020, it was different because then I heard a lot of people say, we did it in 2008, we're doing it again. And I feel like a lot of people missed the point that Hummel has made is that no,
Yeah.
the way in which they're injecting credit or the way they're increasing the money supply is fundamentally completely different than the way they did it in 2008 and 2009. And so I guess my
Yes.
question to you is what was the ramification of that to wrap this conversation up?
Well, high inflation. And so I did write an article. So I was writing an article every 2 weeks for something called Defining Ideas on the Hoover site. And it's now down to every 3 weeks because I was running out of ideas. And I wrote one in 2021, and I think it was called Inflation, True and False. And it was just making a series of
Mm-hmm.
assertions and then backing each one up. And I said that inflation, I think one of my statements was inflation would go above 6%. And I was nervous about saying 10, but I wasn't nervous about saying 6. I think that's right. I didn't review that before this interview. But yeah, because of what I'd learned from, thinking the Hummel way about all this stuff. Um, the other thing, Jeff Hummel and I wrote a piece for Cato back in 2008 that they published as a policy analysis, kind of laying out why we think Greenspan was so successful. And one of the things he did was in 1987, when he faced something like what Bernanke faced in 2008. And he didn't say, oh, I want to pick this financial institution or that financial institution. The Dow Jones fell 22% in one day. It's the biggest percent fall of any time in our history, bigger than Black Tuesday in 1929, substantially bigger. And he just said, flood the market with liquidity. Don't try to pick and choose financial institutions or financial instruments. Just flood the market with liquidity. And we got through it. And so yeah, I think so I think it'd be really good for someone to do an article looking at 87, 2008, and 2020, 2021. That would be a really good article to write.
Yeah, to help us understand the fundamental differences between the way the Fed had responded to the crisis. Did they do the right thing, in your opinion?
In 87, yeah.
What about in 2020?
No. Well,
did they overdo it?
The Fed had a big problem, which is the fiscal side overdid it, right?
Yeah.
And so there was this accord in 1951 between the Treasury and the Fed that the Fed wouldn't just be the handmaiden to the Treasury. We're going to be more than just someone trying to back up your debt. And as Jeff pointed out, I think it was in a private conversation, but maybe it's something he wrote in an email, I'm not sure, where he said, you know what, essentially that accord is, the accord is dead. That's exactly what they're doing now. They're basically trying to back up what kind of buy up the debt that the Treasury issues and sells to the public, and so, yeah, so I don't think that's the right thing, but they were in a tough box. They were. Yeah. So
yeah, because to your point, the spending between the current and prior administration was also extraordinary. So there's two, as I think it was Friedman who said this. You can correct me if I'm wrong. It was too many dollars chasing too few goods, or whoever said that. But that's what inflation is, right?
Yeah. I actually learned that before I'd ever heard of Milton Friedman. It was just like this line that was used when I was a teenager.
Yeah, same.
First learning economics, and Friedman would have agreed with it, but I think it was more basic than that. It was like people give him credit for saying there's no such thing as a free lunch. He certainly said it, but that also preceded him by some number of years.
Maybe 100 years.
It could be. Yeah.
David, this was a lot of fun. I'm really thankful you came on today. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Drew. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it a lot.
Me too. If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn. Or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com. Or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves risks, and you may incur a profit or loss regardless of strategy selected.